The morning sun cast long shadows across the gardens of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window. Her hands trembling slightly, she watched the early morning joggers pass by, unaware that today would mark one of the most difficult days in royal history. The weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders as she turned away from the window and walked toward her dressing table. William was already awake, sitting on the edge of their bed with his head in his hands. The phone call from the palace had come at dawn, delivering news that would change everything. His grandfather's condition had taken a sudden turn, and the family was being called to gather immediately. But this wasn't just any family gathering. This was a farewell that the entire nation would witness. "We need to be strong today," Catherine whispered as she approached her husband. Her voice carried the gentleness that had made her beloved by millions, but William could hear the uncertainty beneath it. He looked up at her, his blue eyes reflecting the same mixture of determination and sorrow that she felt. "I know," he replied, reaching for her hand. "But how do we say goodbye to someone who has been the cornerstone of our lives, our family, and our country?" The question hung in the air between them as they prepared for what would become one of the most watched and emotionally charged events in recent royal history. Catherine chose a simple black dress, the same one she had worn to other solemn occasions. As she fastened her grandmother's pearl necklace, she thought about all the conversations she'd had with the Duke of Edinburgh over the years. Prince Philip had welcomed her into the family with his characteristic directness and unexpected warmth. She remembered their first private conversation after her engagement to William. He had pulled her aside during a family dinner and said, "You'll do well, my dear. You have strength in your eyes. That's what this family needs." Those words had carried her through many difficult moments since. Downstairs in the palace, staff members moved quietly through their morning routines, but everyone could feel the weight of the day ahead. Mrs. Henderson, Catherine's personal assistant, had been with the royal household for 15 years, but she had never experienced anything quite like this. The combination of personal grief and public duty created an atmosphere unlike any other. "Your Royal Highness," she said softly as Catherine entered her office, "the schedule for today has been finalized. The ceremony will begin at 2 o'clock, and the family will gather in the blue drawing room beforehand." Catherine nodded, accepting the detailed itinerary that would guide her through every moment of this goodbye. She scanned the list, noting the precise timing of each element. Everything was planned to the minute, as was tradition, but she knew that no amount of planning could prepare them for the emotional reality of what they would face. William joined them, dressed in his military uniform. The medals on his chest caught the light as he moved, each one representing service and sacrifice, values that his grandfather had embodied throughout his remarkable life. The sight of her husband in uniform always moved Catherine, but today it carried special significance. He was representing not just himself, but generations of duty and honor. "The children?" William asked quietly. "They're with Maria," Catherine replied, referring to their nanny. "George understands what's happening, but Charlotte and Louis—" Her voice trailed off. "How do you explain to young children that their great-grandfather, who had always been a larger-than-life figure in their world, would no longer be there?" They had made the difficult decision to include George in the ceremony, recognizing that at his age, he could understand and find comfort in being part of this significant family moment. Charlotte and Louis would remain at home, too young for such a solemn occasion, but old enough to sense the sadness that had settled over their household. The drive to Windsor Castle was quiet. Catherine watched the familiar countryside pass by, noting how normal everything looked despite the extraordinary circumstances. People were going about their daily lives, unaware that in just a few hours they would witness a goodbye that would resonate far beyond the royal family. As their car approached the castle gates, Catherine saw the crowds that had already begun to gather. Flowers were being laid along the fence, and people of all ages stood in respectful silence. Some held photographs, others clutched handwritten notes. The sight brought tears to her eyes as she realized how deeply this loss was being felt by people who had never met Prince Philip personally, but who had been touched by his decades of service. "Look at them all," she whispered to William. "He would have been so moved by this." William squeezed her hand. He would have pretended to be annoyed by all the fuss. But yes, I think he would have been secretly pleased. Inside the castle, the family was gathering in the private apartments. The Queen sat in her favorite chair, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Despite her age and the weight of her grief, she maintained the composure that had defined her reign. When Catherine approached to pay her respects, the Queen reached out and took her hand. "Thank you for being here, Catherine," she said softly. "Philip was so fond of you. He often said you brought a wonderful lightness to our family." Those words meant everything to Catherine. She had worked hard to find her place within the royal family, to contribute meaningfully while respecting traditions that stretched back centuries. To know that Prince Philip had appreciated her efforts was a gift she would treasure forever. The room was filled with quiet conversations as family members shared memories and drew strength from each other. Catherine found herself thinking about all the family gatherings where Prince Philip had been the center of attention, telling stories from his naval service or sharing his latest environmental concerns. His absence left a void that seemed to make the very air feel different. As the time for the ceremony approached, Catherine made her final preparations. She checked her appearance one last time, ensuring that every detail was perfect. This wasn't about vanity, it was about respect. The nation would be watching, and she wanted to honor Prince Philip's memory by presenting herself with the dignity he would have expected. Standing beside William as they prepared to enter the chapel, Catherine felt the full weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just a family saying goodbye to a beloved patriarch. This was a nation preparing to bid farewell to a man who had devoted his life to service, who had been a constant presence through decades of change and challenge. The chapel doors opened, and together they stepped forward into a moment that would be remembered forever. The goodbye that awaited them would indeed move a nation. But it would also mark the beginning of a new chapter in their own lives, one where they would carry forward the values and memories that Prince Philip had given them. The chapel at Windsor Castle had never felt so heavy with emotion. As Catherine walked beside William down the aisle, she could feel the weight of history pressing down upon them. Every step echoed softly against the ancient stones, each footfall marking another moment in what would become one of the most poignant farewells in royal history. The congregation was smaller than usual royal ceremonies, reflecting the intimate nature of this goodbye. Due to the circumstances of the time, only 30 people could attend, making every presence even more significant. Catherine recognized faces that had been part of their lives for years, family members, close friends, and those who had served alongside Prince Philip in various capacities. As they took their seats in the front row, Catherine's eyes were drawn to the coffin draped in Prince Philip's personal standard. Upon it lay his naval cap, his sword, and a wreath of flowers chosen by the Queen herself. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking. This was the final resting place of a man who had been so full of life, so vibrant and engaged right until the end. William sat perfectly still beside her, his military training evident in his posture, but Catherine could see the tension in his jaw. She knew he was fighting to maintain his composure just as she was. The weight of representing not just themselves but the entire royal family in this moment was overwhelming. The Dean of Windsor began the service with words that had comforted countless families over the centuries, but today they carried special meaning. "We are gathered here to remember before God our brother Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and to comfort one another in our grief." Catherine found herself remembering the last conversation she'd had with Prince Philip. It had been just weeks before, during a quiet family lunch at Windsor. He had been telling stories about his early days with the Queen, his eyes twinkling with the same mischief that had charmed people for decades. "Marriage is about partnership, my dear," he had said to Catherine. "The Queen and I figured that out early on. You and William have that same understanding." Those words echoed in her mind now as she watched the Queen, sitting alone due to the distancing requirements, but carrying herself with the same grace she had shown throughout her reign. Catherine's heart ached for her grandmother-in-law, who was losing not just a husband, but a partner of more than 7 decades. The music began, pieces that Prince Philip himself had chosen years earlier. The haunting melody of Eternal Father, Strong to Save, filled the chapel, and Catherine felt tears threatening to fall. This had been Prince Philip's favorite hymn, often called the naval hymn, connecting him to his years of service at sea. During the reading from Ecclesiastes, Catherine's mind wandered to the many times Prince Philip had spoken about duty and service. He had never sought the spotlight for himself, but had dedicated his life to supporting the Queen and serving the British people. His environmental work, his youth programs, his countless charitable engagements, all of it had been done with a sense of purpose that inspired everyone around him. William was chosen to give a reading, and as he stood at the lectern, Catherine felt immense pride in her husband. His voice was steady and clear as he read from the Gospel of John, the words carrying across the chapel with strength and dignity. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." The words seemed particularly fitting for Prince Philip, who had indeed laid down his life in service to others. Not in a single dramatic moment, but day by day, year by year, putting duty before personal preference, public service before private comfort. As William returned to his seat, Catherine reached for his hand. The gesture was subtle but necessary. They were supporting each other through this most difficult moment. Around them, she could see other family members doing the same, drawing strength from their bonds with each other. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered a sermon that captured Prince Philip's essence beautifully. He spoke of a man who had been environmentally aware for most of his life, well before it became fashionable, and someone who could be blunt in speech and unwelcome in intervention, but his sincerity was never in doubt. Catherine smiled through her tears at this description. It was so perfectly accurate. Prince Philip had indeed been blunt, sometimes startlingly so, but it had always come from a place of genuine care and conviction. She remembered family dinners where he would challenge everyone at the table, not to be difficult, but to make them think more deeply about important issues. The prayers began, and Catherine found herself thinking about the future. How would the family function without Prince Philip's steady presence? How would the Queen manage without her constant companion? How would they all carry forward the legacy he had built? But as she looked around the chapel at the faces of her family, she began to see the answer. Prince Philip's influence was evident in all of them. William's commitment to environmental causes, the way he approached his royal duties with both seriousness and humanity, these were reflections of his grandfather's example. The service included a moment of reflection where the congregation sat in silence, remembering Prince Philip in their own ways. Catherine used this time to think about all the ways he had shaped her own understanding of royal duty. When she had first joined the family, he had been one of the first to make her feel truly welcome. She remembered a garden party where she had been feeling overwhelmed by the number of people and the constant attention. Prince Philip had appeared at her side and said, "The trick is to remember that they're all just people, my dear. Talk to them as you would anyone else, and you'll do fine." That advice had served her well countless times since. The final hymn was, "Guide me, O thou great Redeemer," and as the voices rose together in the chapel, Catherine felt something shift. The sadness remained, but it was joined by something else. Gratitude. Gratitude for having known Prince Philip, for having been part of his family, for having witnessed his example of service and dedication. As the service drew to a close, the last post sounded, its haunting notes filling every corner of the chapel. Catherine watched as William's shoulders squared slightly, his military bearing taking over as he honored his grandfather one final time. The minute of silence that followed was profound, a moment when time seemed to stop as everyone said their private goodbyes. When the coffin was lifted for the procession to the royal vault, Catherine stood with the rest of the family. This was the moment she had been dreading most, watching Prince Philip leave them for the final time. As the procession began to move, she fell into step beside William, their children's great-grandfather making his final journey. The walk to the royal vault felt both endless and far too short. Catherine found herself memorizing every detail, the way the afternoon light filtered through the chapel windows, the sound of their footsteps on the stone floor, the faces of the guards who stood at attention as they passed. At the vault, the final prayers were said, and Prince Philip was laid to rest. Catherine stood with her family as they said their last goodbyes to a man who had been so much more than they could ever adequately express. He had been a father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and constant source of strength for the monarchy and the nation. As they prepared to leave the chapel, Catherine felt William's hand find hers again. Together they would face whatever came next, carrying with them the lessons and love that Prince Philip had given them. The goodbye that had moved a nation was complete, but the legacy would live on in all of them. The journey back to Kensington Palace was wrapped in a silence that spoke volumes. Catherine sat beside William in the royal car, both of them lost in their own thoughts, as the countryside of Windsor gave way to the busy streets of London. The ceremony was over, the farewell complete, but the emotional weight of what they had just experienced seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. Catherine watched the people lining the streets as their convoy passed. Many held flowers, some wiped away tears, others simply stood in respectful silence. The outpouring of love and respect from the British people was overwhelming. She had always known that Prince Philip was respected, but seeing this genuine grief from strangers brought home just how deeply he had touched the nation's heart. "He would have been amazed by all this," William said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse from holding back emotion during the service. All his life he insisted he was just doing his job. Catherine nodded, remembering how Prince Philip had often deflected praise or attention. He had been genuinely uncomfortable with being celebrated, always preferring to focus on the work itself rather than recognition for it. Yet here was an entire nation stopping to honor his memory. When they arrived at Kensington Palace, the children were waiting in the drawing room with their nanny. George stood up straight when his parents entered, trying to mirror the formal behavior he had been taught, but Charlotte and Louis rushed forward for hugs, sensing that their parents needed comfort. "How was great-grandpapa's special day?" Charlotte asked, her innocent question cutting straight to Catherine's heart. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that they had just said goodbye forever to someone they loved? "It was very beautiful," Catherine said, kneeling down to Charlotte's level. "Everyone came together to remember all the wonderful things great-grandpapa did and to say how much we loved him." George, at 8, understood more about what had happened. "Will we see him again?" he asked quietly. William sat down beside his eldest son, putting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Not in the way we used to, George, but we'll always have our memories of him, and we can honor him by trying to be as helpful and kind as he was." Catherine watched this exchange with a mixture of pride and sadness. William was handling this difficult conversation with exactly the right balance of honesty and comfort that their children needed. It was another reminder of how Prince Philip's influence lived on in the way they approached their most important responsibilities as parents. That evening, after the children were in bed, Catherine found herself in the palace gardens. The spring air was cool and fresh, and she needed the quiet space to process everything that had happened. The formal farewell was complete, but the personal grief was just beginning. William found her there, sitting on the bench where they often came to talk through difficult decisions. He sat beside her without speaking, both of them looking up at the stars that were just becoming visible in the darkening sky. "I keep thinking about what he said to me before our wedding," Catherine finally said. "He pulled me aside and told me that the most important thing I could do for this family was to keep you grounded, to make sure you never forgot that beneath all the titles and duties, you were just William." "He was right," William replied. "He always saw things so clearly. Even when the rest of us were caught up in protocol or tradition, he could cut through to what really mattered." Catherine thought about all the times Prince Philip had done exactly that. During family meetings, he would often be the one to ask the practical questions that no one else dared voice. When discussions became too formal or removed from reality, he would bring them back to earth with his characteristic directness. "What do you think he would want us to do now?" she asked. William was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I think he would want us to keep working, to not let grief stop us from doing the job we're meant to do. But I also think he would want us to remember why we do it, for the people, not for the institution." Over the following days, Catherine found herself thinking constantly about how to honor Prince Philip's memory. The official mourning period would last for several weeks, but she knew that the real tribute would be in how they carried forward his values and commitments. She began reaching out to the charities and organizations that Prince Philip had supported throughout his life. The Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme in particular held special meaning for her. She had seen firsthand how the program changed young people's lives, giving them confidence and skills they might never have developed otherwise. "I want to become more involved with the award scheme," she told William one morning over breakfast. "Not to replace what Grandpapa did, but to continue his work in my own way." William smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she had seen from him since the funeral. He would love that. He was always saying that the program needed fresh energy and new perspectives. Catherine also found herself thinking differently about her public engagements. Prince Philip had taught her that every interaction mattered, that even the briefest conversation with a member of the public could have a lasting impact. She began to approach her duties with a new sense of purpose, seeing each event as an opportunity to serve in the way he had shown her. The first public appearance after the funeral was particularly emotional. Catherine and William visited a youth center in East London, one that ran programs similar to those Prince Philip had championed. As they spoke with young people about their goals and challenges, Catherine could almost hear Prince Philip's voice encouraging them to push themselves further. "My husband's grandfather always believed that young people could achieve amazing things if they were given the right opportunities," Catherine told a group of teenagers. "He spent his whole life creating those opportunities, and we want to continue that work." One young woman, barely 18, approached Catherine as they were preparing to leave. "Your Royal Highness," she said nervously, "I just wanted to say that the Duke of Edinburgh Award changed my life. I was really struggling in school, but the program taught me that I could do things I never thought possible." Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes. This was exactly what Prince Philip had hoped to achieve. Not grand gestures or public recognition, but real changes in individual lives. These were the moments that had driven him for more than 60 years of public service. That night, Catherine called the Queen to share the story of their visit. Her Majesty's voice was warm with pride as she listened. "Philip would have been so pleased to hear that," the Queen said. "He always said that the real measure of success wasn't in the numbers or statistics, but in the individual stories of young people who discovered their own potential." As the weeks passed, Catherine began to see how the entire family was finding their own ways to honor Prince Philip's legacy. William threw himself into his environmental work with renewed passion, knowing how much climate change had mattered to his grandfather. The Queen, despite her grief, continued her duties with the same dedication she had always shown. Catherine found her own path in expanding her work with early childhood development. Prince Philip had always been fascinated by education and youth development, and she felt that focusing on the earliest years of life was a natural extension of his interests. Children's futures are shaped so much in those first few years, she explained to William. If we can help parents and caregivers give children the best possible start, we're continuing Grandpapa's work in a different way. The months that followed brought both challenges and moments of unexpected joy. Catherine discovered that grief wasn't a linear process. Some days she felt strong and purposeful, while others left her overwhelmed by the absence of Prince Philip's steady presence in their lives. But gradually, she began to understand what Prince Philip had really given them. It wasn't just the memories of his wit and wisdom, or even the example of his service. It was the confidence to continue the work, the knowledge that they were capable of carrying forward the values he had embodied. During a quiet family dinner 6 months after the funeral, George asked a question that surprised everyone. "Mama, do you think Great-Grandpapa knows that we're still doing his work?" Catherine looked around the table at her family, William, their 3 children, and the shared sense of purpose that connected them all. "I think he does, darling," she said softly. "I think he's very proud of all of us." As she spoke those words, Catherine realized that the goodbye that had moved a nation had transformed into something more lasting and powerful. It had become a promise to continue serving, to keep working for the causes Prince Philip had cared about, and to raise their children with the same values he had lived by. The farewell was complete, but the legacy would continue for generations to come. In that continuation, Prince Philip's true immortality lay, not in monuments or memorials, but in the daily acts of service and compassion that he had inspired in all those who loved him.